Hello everyone! It's been really hot in Japan lately, and maybe because of that, I've been seeing more and more comments on my videos and streams from people saying that their FPS isn't stable. So, in today's video, I'm going to analyze actual data recorded while playing Fortnite Mobile and take a closer look at how thermal throttling causes FPS to drop. By the end of this video, I think you'll have a much better understanding of why preventing thermal throttling is so important, as well as what you can do to reduce its effects. So, let's get started. First, let's quickly go over the basics of thermal throttling. Thermal throttling is a protective feature found in smartphones and tablets. When the device gets too hot, it intentionally reduces its performance to protect the hardware. When you run demanding workloads, such as a 3D game, the CPU and GPU can operate at very high load. As a result, the chipset generates more and more heat. However, compared with a PC, smartphones and tablets have much less space and fewer options for dissipating that heat. So the internal temperature gradually increases. When the temperature approaches a certain limit, sensors inside the device detect it. The device then automatically reduces processing performance in order to reduce heat generation. As the device cools down, performance can recover. Then the device heats up again, reaches the temperature limit, reduces performance again, cools down, and performance recovers once more. This cycle repeats over and over. That is thermal throttling. Next, let's talk about the test setup. For this test, I'm using the Honor Magic Pad 3 Pro. I'm not using the Vivo IQ00 Pad 6 Pro for this test. I won't go into the details in this video, but I'm planning to cover the IQ00 Pad 6 Pro in a separate video. Now, let's talk about how the testing was performed. I played matches lasting around 15 minutes several times with a cooling fan and several times without one. During each match, I recorded various performance and temperature data. The cooling fan used in this test is a tablet cooling fan like this one. I bought it on Amazon for around $20. The data I collected includes FPS, refresh rate, CPU temperature, GPU temperature, battery, temperature, ambient temperature. The corresponding colors and labels used in the graphs are shown here. For reference, I've also summarized how each parameter was measured. There is one important thing I want to mention about the FPS data. The FPS, shown by Fortnite's built-in FPS counter, is captured from the screen and converted into numerical data using OCR. Because of this, the accuracy is lower than using an app that can directly obtain system-level FPS data, such as through Shizuku. So, there is a relatively large margin of error in the FPS data. Please keep that in mind when looking at the results. For the ambient temperature, I'm using a Xiaomi temperature sensor. The temperature data is retrieved in real time via Bluetooth using GAT. For this test, I wanted to simulate a typical summer environment where you would normally play Fortnite with air conditioning. So, I conducted the test at an ambient temperature of approximately 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. As you can see in the graphs later, the ambient temperature generally stayed within this range. Now, let's take a look at the data recorded without a cooling fan. This graph shows FPS, refresh rate, battery temperature, and ambient temperature. It's a little difficult to see the ambient temperature here, so let's focus on that for a moment. The numbers indicate the maximum and minimum temperatures measured within each 3-minute interval. As you can see, the ambient temperature stayed between approximately 24 and 26 degrees Celsius. The background colors represent the thermal status of the smartphone or tablet. In general, Android has 7 thermal status levels. However, levels 6 and 7 are extremely rare, so for normal testing, it's reasonable to consider level 5 critical as the highest practical level. The higher the thermal status level becomes, the greater the impact of thermal throttling can be. Looking at this graph, we can see that from around the 2-minute mark onward, the thermal status remains at the maximum practical level, critical. Next, let's look at the battery temperature. First, let's check the correlation between battery temperature and CPU temperature, and between battery temperature and GPU temperature. In both cases, when the CPU or GPU temperature increases or decreases, the battery temperature tends to move in the same direction. So, it seems reasonable to say that there is a correlation between them. This means that from this point forward, we can focus mainly on battery temperature. Next, let's look at the refresh rate. After around the 5-minute mark, we can see that the refresh rate is being reduced to 90 Hz more frequently. Now, let's compare that with the battery temperature. When the battery temperature reaches around 60 degrees Celsius, the refresh rate drops to 90 Hz. So, there appears to be a clear correlation between battery temperature and refresh rate. Now, let's look at the FPS. Around the point where the thermal status reaches critical, the maximum FPS appears to be limited to around 110 frames per second. And if we display the refresh rate on the same graph, we can see something even more interesting. When the refresh rate drops to 90 Hz, the FPS is also limited to around 90 frames per second. Now, let's take a closer look at the actual effects of thermal throttling. One of the easiest relationships to understand is the correlation between battery, temperature, and refresh rate. When the battery temperature approaches around 60 degrees Celsius, the refresh rate starts to decrease. As a result, the battery temperature also begins to drop. This shows that the thermal throttling system is actively working to control the temperature. But there is another side to this. It also means that FPS drops are occurring frequently. Now, let's look at the results when using a cooling fan. The ambient temperature was slightly higher than during the test without the fan. However, even at the end of the match, the thermal status remained at level 4. As for the refresh rate, it briefly dropped to 60 Hz right after the test started. After that, however, it remained at 120 Hz. Because the refresh rate remained stable and the thermal status never reached the critical level, the FPS was much less affected by thermal throttling. The battery temperature also leveled off just below 60 degrees Celsius. This means that the cooling fan successfully prevented the device from reaching the temperature conditions that would cause significant thermal throttling. Now, let's compare the average FPS between these two tests. Without a cooling fan, the average FPS was 93.9 frames per second. With a cooling fan, the average FPS was 112.8 frames per second. That's a difference of almost 20 frames per second. And remember, this was with the same device and essentially the same gaming workload. The main difference was whether or not a cooling fan was being used. One important note, there is one thing I want to clarify. On Android devices, there is a known issue where the refresh rate can suddenly drop while playing Fortnite at 120 frames per second. This issue can occur even when thermal throttling is not happening. The Magic Pad 3 Pro is affected by this issue as well. During this test, whenever the refresh rate dropped unexpectedly, I opened the recent app screen and attempted to restore the refresh rate. This was done to minimize the impact of this separate issue on the test results. However, when thermal throttling occurs, opening the recent app screen does not restore the performance. So, it is important to distinguish between these two situations. Based on the results of this test, I hope you now have a better understanding of how thermal throttling actually works and why using a cooling fan can be so important when playing Fortnite Mobile. Without cooling, the device temperature rises, the thermal status increases, the refresh rate can be reduced, and ultimately, the FPS can drop significantly. On the other hand, keeping the device temperature under control can help maintain a higher and more stable refresh rate and FPS. In this test, the difference was almost 20 frames per second on average. So, if you're experiencing unstable FPS during long Fortnite mobile sessions, especially in a hot environment, controlling the temperature may make a much bigger difference than you might expect. That's all for today's video. If you found this video useful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.